ancient writers who had no affinity for Christianity but still wrote about the events that are talked about in the Bible. I found that really interesting in my own search. So we'll be doing that. Before we do, I think John Sandusky is going to open us in prayer. He's doing a little bit with the audio there, but you ready? All right, we'll open in prayer.
Father, we come to you this time of study, this midweek study that we have. We're grateful for the evening we have, and those who have come out. Thankful for Andrew taking time to prepare for the class and study at home and to bring the lessons. Pray that you'll be with those who are teaching downstairs, and be with those who are not able to come out tonight, those who want to be here, those who need the strength to make those decisions, or who have sicknesses at this time. We pray that you'll bless the service here, and that each of us can be lifted up a little in the middle of this week. We ask this through your Son's name, Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen. Thank you. Okay. So I told you we're going to start with evidence for Christ. We're not going to start with evidence for Christ. We're actually going to start with a little bit of discussion about how do we know history is real? Because I think these are some tools that are very useful in evaluating the things that we come across when we get to this part of the study. How do we know anything that happened in the past really happened if we weren't there to see it ourselves? That's kind of what we want to get at. If we look at events in our own recent history, I was 5 years old when 9/11 happened. I don't remember that myself. I didn't witness it. I didn't see the events when they unfolded. Those of you who are older and have memory of that, I'm sure you remember seeing those events. You saw when that happened. You knew what the world was like after that happened. I did not. So I learned about it after the fact from footage and pictures and discussions and reading about it, about the events. Photography and video has made it very easy to document things for history's sake. We can see footage from speeches, from wars. There's wartime footage. There's photos of people and events. But the further back you go in history, how do we establish that those things really happened? So I want to talk about two things. One is the types of historical evidence we might come across. And then the other is what are some of the questions we need to ask ourselves when we're evaluating whether or not something is historically accurate. So first, we'll talk about the types of historical evidence. How do we establish history as a fact? I threw out some things in the questions here, but I didn't really go into a lot of detail, so this is where I'm going to ask for your participation. History can be supported, I'll throw out the first one, with physical evidence. What are some examples of physical evidence that tell us about historical facts?
Battlefields.
Okay, battlefields. I'm going to write small, sorry. Maybe just locations. Or buildings, maybe?
Documents.
Documents, okay. Having, maybe more specific, when thinking about physical evidence, what do you mean? Like the Constitution?
Yeah, either like physical writings or pictures, even sketch drawings.
Okay, that's another good one to bring up is art or images. Art or images, paintings of events, pictograms of events. In the course of researching this, one of the sites I was reading mentioned Native American history is largely told through images. They would paint and draw their history on the walls of teepees and on animal skins, and those paintings, they didn't have written language. Those paintings represented the documentation of historical events in their culture. So images can tell us a lot about history. Those can be a form of physical evidence. What are some other kinds of historical evidence?
Other archaeological evidence. I mean, art and images fall into that category, but so do, utensils for cooking and different things that people used as tools on a day-to-day basis are different than arts and images. They're more, objects that archaeologists discover, weapons are found, other stuff like that.
Yeah, items that speak to everyday life. So physical items that we find. One of the most telling kinds of archaeological sites when they find them is trash. Trash piles tend to be very valuable when archaeologists find them because not only do they tell you what kinds of things the culture had, they also kind of give you an idea of timeline because they put trash on top of trash on top of trash. And so by seeing where the trash is in the dig can give them an idea of, okay, this was early in the city's history, this was later in the city's history. So it can give them a way to date some of the things that they find based on where they find it. Okay? Anything else? There's one other, maybe somewhat big category. It's kind of like archaeology. It's not objects per se, but I thought I heard it maybe. Human remains, bodies. Or graves. We get a lot of historical information from graves because throughout culture, graves are intended to be preserved, right? We tend to bury things and we tend to seal them and preserve them in such a way that that's sometimes one of the few remaining records that we have of a culture. A lot of the Egyptology and information we know about ancient Egypt is because of the way that they buried their dead and the way that they would bury everyday objects with their deceased. And the pyramids themselves, these structures that stand even to this day, are giant tombs. So that's a big way that we get things in terms of physical evidence. What other kinds of historical evidence besides physical evidence? Now we're kind of looking at more at the idea of information. What other kinds of historical evidence do we find?
Eyewitness report.
What was that?
Eyewitnesses.
Eyewitness report. Okay. I'm going to use another word for that. Is primary sources. So a primary source is someone who is an eyewitness. They are writing about their own experience or something that they either did or saw, something that they encountered. Okay?
Biographical or autobiographical sources, somebody may write a story about themselves and their experiences, or someone else, not necessarily an eyewitness, may compile information from those who were eyewitnesses and then write about someone or some event in order to preserve it for history's purpose.
Okay. So an autobiography is a primary source. That's somebody writing about their own life. I think Ben Franklin's autobiography is like 3 volumes long or something, or 4 volumes long. He had a lot to say about himself. But then biographers, they fall into a different category, right? They are secondary sources. And all a secondary source means is just that they are not claiming to have seen it themselves. They're not claiming to have discovered this themselves. They are typically historians or researchers who read the primary sources and they condense that down and they usually interpret it and present it to you as a complete picture. So history textbooks, most history books you would read at the library, most biographies, they would fall under the realm of these secondary sources. It doesn't mean that secondary sources are inferior to primary sources, although if you're a historian, usually a primary source is the most valuable. Secondary sources sometimes can be the only way that we know about a primary source, and we'll actually encounter that in some of the evidence we'll look at later. There are ancient writers who reference another author that existed during the time, and we don't have that other author's works. We don't have examples of their writings on papyrus or on tablets that we can actually read, but we know they existed because someone else wrote about the thing that they wrote about, and they quote this other author in their writing. And if it's, if most of what the secondary source says is corroborated by other forms of history, we tend to say that's pretty good evidence for the primary writer that they're citing. Okay? One other category that I thought of, sort of separate from primary and secondary sources, is oral history, or maybe tradition. So some historical circles view oral history as almost akin to a primary source. Others say maybe you need to be careful because it's stories that get passed down through a culture and they get passed down from generation to generation. One interesting study I came across, there's some recent scholarly work going on that's actually looking at native oral histories and how little they appear to have changed from what can be known from the historical records. So in some cultures at least, oral history has been known to be very reputable and not changing a lot over time. So there's some historians who will say oral history is very, very good for the most part in terms of it doesn't tend to change very quickly. But I think it's fair to take it with a grain of salt. We've all played the telephone game. Okay, so these are kind of the pieces of evidence, the things that we might actually find, the things we might actually read. And you know, a primary source could be a piece of physical evidence. We might find papyrus or scrolls, you know, that are maybe written by the person who is the primary source, or maybe it's a copy of something that's written from a primary source. And then other times it's more like an archival document, like Aaron mentioned. That would be maybe like a secondary source, or just a historian who they set about to, I'm going to write down a history of this time period, I'm going to write down a history of events. So a historian would be a secondary source who says they're going to compile all the primary sources and maybe mentions the physical evidence. Okay, so then the next part of this is, what are the questions we want to ask ourselves when we are evaluating history? What do you all think? What are some of the questions or criticisms we should have of history as we're reading it? Go ahead, Dan.
So how many similar or how many alternate accounts there are of the same event or the events? So sometimes there's how do you say that word? Cooperating.
Right.
I can't even say it right. Yeah. Accounts, but there's also some that are divergent accounts. Or is it, the guy who won telling the story, or the guy who lost telling the story?
Right. So Dan brings up two really important things that are both questions that demand our attention when we're looking at history. What is another source that says the same thing as the source that I'm looking at? Can I find two people who wrote about the same event and they tell the same story? If they're not working together, if they're independent of each other, that's a really good sign that the thing I'm reading about, the thing that they're saying, has a high likelihood of having occurred. If we see accounts that differ, that is another thing that should really capture our attention. If something's different between two accounts, if there's a key detail, maybe it's an irrelevant detail and we don't really concern ourselves with that too much, but if it's a key detail, we've got to ask the question, okay, why are they telling a different story? What would be the reason for those accounts being different? Here's one I found. This was kind of an interesting statement. This was from the American Historical Association. And they made a statement here that history is not a collection of facts. What do you think about that statement? Do you agree with that statement or disagree?
On the surface, disagree.
Okay. Why do you disagree on the surface?
Because I've always understood history to be a collection of facts.
Okay, that's fair enough. That's a legitimate answer. I'll take that.
You can see an event from different viewpoints, and so with being told, I guess it would be a fact. Aaron sees it this direction, and I see it in another direction. So both facts. I guess you can say, yeah, they're both facts. It's just different viewpoints.
Right.
So
I think it depends on where you're gathering your facts from.
I was a little unfair. I was a little unfair to you all. I didn't read the whole statement, but I appreciate the answers. I would agree. On its face, it seems like an odd thing to say. The statement is, history is not a collection of facts, but it is an argument for what happened on the basis of the recorded evidence. In other words, it's saying that we have to be aware that we did not observe these events. The people who are writing about the events, typically, unless they're primary sources, did not observe the events. But we're taking the sum of the evidence, which evidence is factual. The pyramids are there. You can go see them. You can see pictures of them, okay? The pyramids are a fact, but the story of history that explains those pyramids being there has elements of interpretation or arguments that take a look at all the evidence and try to come up with a best explanation. By the way, when it comes to how they were built, there's still not really a consensus on the method that was used. The aliens did it.
What about biases? I mean, is that in the different accounts, or what would you say about biases in the interpretation of history?
Yeah, I think bias is a really important question also to ask ourselves. Maybe a couple of quick and short ones. When was the history written? If we're talking about written history, when was it written in relation to the events that it describes? So, does it come from a historian writing about the Civil War in 1960? In that case, he's about 100 years separate from the events that he's writing about. Is it a letter from a Union soldier to his wife back home that comes from the same time period, in which case it's less than a year? That historical piece of evidence comes from the year of the events that it's describing. So when is it from? Who is the author? Who wrote it? Who was it written to? What was that?
Who's it about?
Who's it about? Yeah, I think for any of these, you're evaluating the content of what's being said. So we talked about similarities between the accounts, differences between the accounts. And then what in the evidence supports your argument? And Jeff mentioned bias. One of the sources I was reading had a blurb about that. There are events in history in which there are winners and losers. I'm putting air quotes on winners and losers. But when that happens, and this is a common occurrence, it is far more likely that the sources and the history that we read today was recorded by the winners. It's kind of a ism, history is written by the victors, but it's true. It's absolutely true that the winners tend to be the ones who get to tell the story after the fact, especially if the losers are no longer around. And that can further obscure or bias our understanding of reality. This American Historians Association used the example of during the Spanish conquest of Central America. Of course, we know from most of recorded history is written down by the Spaniards, by the conquistadors, and they wrote their accounts of the battles that took place and the cities that they conquered and the kings that they conquered, the kings of the native Central American people, the Aztecs. And in their version of history, they are victors and they are victorious. And they note that the conquest of some of these areas took from, I forget now the years, it was like 1650 to 1659 or something like that. It was like a span of multiple years. And there's all these letters from conquistadors that they were sending to like the governors of Cuba and back to the King of Spain that were very, very positive. And they were like, oh, it's going great. The conquest is going great. The war's going great. And what they were pointing out was, okay, they're the ones who won. When was it written? During the events that were occurring or shortly after. Who wrote it? The conquistadors. Who was the audience? The King of Spain. What do they want? They want money so that they can keep on doing their conquests. So, they put things in a very positive light. And there was no accounts or writing down of that history from the people that they were killing in Central America. We don't have their history. So it's just something to watch out for. It's something that's a warning when it comes to understanding bias.
What do you think about
Yeah.
the credentials or the reputation of the writer
Mhm.
of a historical document? Where would you put that?
Right. So, when we ask ourselves who wrote it, credentials I would say in different contexts, I would look at credentials differently. If I was looking at a history textbook or a history book, I would hope that the person writing it has some years of study or some years of familiarity with the era of history that they're dealing with, or maybe they are particularly a historian of a certain time period or a certain culture. Maybe they're just a historian by education, or that's been kind of their career path. If you're talking about primary sources, I think credentials can be viewed a little differently because, we have memoirs written by everyday ordinary people. There's letters written by soldiers in war, or letters from one common person to another. So, they have no credentials from an academic standpoint. They didn't go to school to write their letter back home. But they have an identity that matches with the history that's being talked about. So in that case, even though they don't have credentials, they are an eyewitness, or what they're writing is in some way autobiographical. That can be very, very valuable when evaluating history.
One of the things that I found really interesting reading historical novels would be the bibliography, and particularly a particular writer that I've read several things. A book that he wrote on D-Day, he has the name, rank, serial number, hometown, and usually the address of all the soldiers that he interviewed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And of course, most of them are no longer living.
Right.
But that was his source. And it would be possible if you had questions to go back to records and find that those people existed or that they didn't.
Yes. And that's another good thing to bring up here is, well, I'll put it over here actually. If they're a secondary source, who are they citing? Because this is something that's very easy to skip over when you're reading, particularly articles online or articles in general. A good secondary source is going to put references, right? They're going to, you see those little footnote numbers when you're reading, and if you drop to the bottom of the page, or maybe it's in the back of the book, they're going to have a bibliography, they're going to have references. And what you will sometimes find is that a secondary source might cite a reference that itself is a secondary source, and that secondary source might be citing a reference that itself is a secondary source. It is more effective if the writer you're reading cites a primary source. And if it's something that you can go and find and read the original text, I came across this in one of the apologetics books I was actually reading for this class. They had a bunch of references and citations it was when I was reading about some of the cosmological arguments. They had a bunch of references and citations, and it was to other creationism and other apologetics books. Most of them actually by the same author, which I found kind of funny. He was citing his own books in his other book, which is not really a good practice. It's not really as academically doing your due diligence to keep citing other secondary sources. Stuff gets lost in that chain. If you can go straight to the primary source, it stops there. If you can read the letter that the Civil War soldier wrote to his family, and it has the date and time of a certain battle in that letter, you've gone to the primary source. It stops there. Dan?
I was thinking, when we look back, some of the, famous Renaissance painters, what we would call the masters or whatever, it's very famous popular thing for them to paint depictions of biblical events.
Yes.
And they were 1,200, 1,500, 1,600 years after the fact, and they were, so, when you're looking at these, the Last Supper, we want to, take that painting, it was nothing remotely close to the way things happened, but yet, here we are, 300 or 400 years later, or 500 years later, we're still looking back at this as a piece of artwork, as opposed to a real depiction of what's going on. And I just got to thinking, or in another 100 or 200 years, are we going to have people that are looking at studio-produced movies that were for entertainment as documentaries, not knowing the difference between a documentary and a piece of fiction, or a docudrama, I guess you would call it, or a based on real facts, but it's still a story version, a presentable version of what happened.
Yeah.
So we have to be careful. You say, well, I saw it in black and white, or I saw it on film. Well, was it actually a documentary, or was it a reproduction, or were they reenacting the events with actors and still putting their own twist on what's going on? So
Yeah.
there's some of those things that are like the trials at Nuremberg are out there. But I saw something here a couple of weeks ago about the history behind that. It was the ability to produce that and record the Nuremberg trials was extremely difficult. They couldn't be in the courtroom with the loud recording cameras because they were too loud for the event. And so they were only allowed to be behind in certain places and only would be able to record at certain times. Yet that's what, every time you see that talked about, they bring out those same pieces of footage that were recorded at one time.
Right.
Yet there's been a couple of 3 different movies about that, which were done, and they didn't have the same limitations.
Yeah, Dan brings up a really good point, which is any kind of source, any kind of information or media that we consume, we can ask these questions, and we can use these questions to try to figure out, okay, how much are they trying to present something that's true? You know, I saw a couple movies recently, and you sometimes see the on the poster or on the trailers, based on a true story, you know? And that phrase, I've learned, means almost nothing. Because one of my favorite things to do while I'm watching this movie that's based on a true story is I immediately start Googling, okay, is this real? Did that really happen? Did it really happen that way? I watched a movie about Elvis recently that was full of, you know, they blend the timeline. They put events that happened at a different time in a different place, talk to a different person, but they do it for dramatic effect, right? When was it written? So you can answer that, but who wrote it? You know, if it's a director, if it's a Hollywood producer, you know, then who is the audience? Well, the audience is the movie-going public. And why? Maybe it's to inform. There's some movies that I think they really set out to try to capture things accurately, but they're also trying to entertain us. So, you know, you got to understand the purpose for which it was written. It's not necessarily to be a depository of facts to be passed down for all of posterity.
Kind of those 2 things with the artwork of depictions of what happened, because there's a lot of things that their depictions of what happened
Yes.
are not even remotely close to what everybody thinks.
Oh yeah. But thank you for bringing that up though again, because I wanted to talk about that too. Let's run through this exercise with those paintings, with the Renaissance artwork, because I think there's some interesting things you can pull out from that. You know, when was the art made? Okay, Renaissance or Middle Ages, medieval time period for a lot of them. Let's use, you know, the Last Supper by Da Vinci as an example. You know, people make the joke, you know, oh, when did someone say cheese? They all lined up on the same side of the table and they're all looking, you know, in the same direction. So it was made by an artist, but then when you think about who is the audience and you start thinking about the time period in which that was made, people couldn't read. So a lot of the art that was created during that time wasn't meant to necessarily capture the facts, but it was meant to tell the story. So you can see the face of each one of the apostles, and the artist tried to put something in the face of the apostles that would tell you what they were feeling or what they were thinking. So Judas is kind of like, you know, he's frowning, or he's kind of dark and shadowy. And the artist is doing this because he is trying to tell the Bible story to people who can't read the Bible. So a lot of those pictures, they look fake, they look posed and set up, and that's for a reason. And I think that's just an interesting way that, you know, understanding the context of why it is the way it is from a historical standpoint, it helps us understand, yeah, it's not meant to document facts, but it's meant to tell a story. So we can do a lot of things like that. Go ahead.
I think that's true with a lot of artwork in ancient cathedrals too, and I think we tend to criticize it as enshrining things and image worship and all that kind of stuff. And certainly there are people who use it in that way today, but the reality is that a lot of it originated because people couldn't read, and it was a way for them to be able to essentially tell themselves the Bible story as they went through the cathedral by looking at the artwork.
Yeah.
And so it had a noble purpose that has been abused, kind of like Nehushtan, with Moses making the bronze serpent.
Oh, okay.
That later during Nehemiah's day, or Hezekiah's day, was being worshipped as an idol or an image.
Right.
And so, I mean, here was an object that God had them create for a good purpose that later became an object of evil. But I think that can be true of some of that artwork that we're talking about too.
Yeah. And even the architecture itself of the buildings. We were in a cathedral last year, and we learned about the architecture of the building, and there's there's the nave, and there's like the area where the altar is and everything that we would consider, the front, the pulpit area. And then it's very, very, very tall, and you look all the way up at the top, and there's a window that's a triangle all the way up at the top, and it's a triangle made of triangles. And the tour guide told us that this part of the building was designed so that you look up and it seems like you just go higher and higher and higher, and you can't believe how high it goes, and then there's a symbol of the Trinity. And it was intended to show that God is above everything. And so when you were a worshiper in this place and you look up, it was supposed to tell a story of God is represented by this visual symbol. Not that the window is being worshipped, the window is not an idol, but it's telling a story. Things like that can be, I find, really interesting. Was there another hand that went up that I saw? Jeff?
I was just thinking, newscasts, how it's supposed to be recent history, but when you go down through those questions there, you watch Fox News versus CNN, and they're totally different.
Right.
Because of the audience, and they try to support, their arguments with the evidence that they have, but and we understand if it's that recent, and they can't get it right, we go down through those questions, and we see that happens.
Sure.
A long time ago.
Well, I've got a few things to say about that, but I won't necessarily say all of them. But that is a good point where there are cases where recent does not mean better. And in the case of news, I would argue, is not even really intended to document history. News is intended to try to, as quickly as possible, let you know what's happening. So news gets things wrong because sometimes the story's still unfolding, sometimes the details aren't all out yet, but they got to fill airtime, so they get all these people to speculate and talk about it and say what they think, and so they fill that time with a lot of nonsense where they're not documenting history. They're just trying to not have dead air when they really don't have anything else to say at the moment. I also am of the opinion that a lot of the news today is not meant for historical documentation. I'd say it's not even for news documentation, it's entertainment. And some of them have gone to court and said in court, we are not news, we are entertainment, in order to avoid lawsuits. But anyway. Okay, sorry, was there something that I missed? Okay. I wanted to do another exercise. So thinking about the types of physical evidence and the kinds of critical questions you would ask, I want someone to prove to me that George Washington was the first president of the United States. How would you prove it? He wasn't? On a technicality, maybe the office was.
First, there was a president of the Continental Congress, which technically was, and I don't remember that guy's name, but nobody remembers his name.
Yeah, I can't remember who that was either. Okay, Dan's technicality aside, prove to me that George Washington's a real person. Prove to me that he's first president. How would you do it? How do we know George Washington existed? How do we know he's not our Paul Bunyan or our Osiris or Achilles? How do we know he's not a myth?
We have his signature on the Constitution.
Okay. There's some physical evidence. We've got things that have his signature on it. Could be fake, but it's something. What else do we have?
Secondary sources, the biographies, and we got buildings, acknowledging, Washington D.C.
Sure. So we've got places that bear his name, monuments to him that are prominent and you can go see. Chuck mentioned biographers and book writers talk about him. What are they drawing from? How do they know he's real?
Yeah, family records.
Okay, there's family records. He has descendants that are still living, I assume.
There's land records because he was a surveyor, so there's also secondary documentation of him where he actually has papers and documents on that he has approved it because of his previous work.
Okay, so we've got documents. We've got letters and correspondence from Washington. We have his home, Mount Vernon, that is claimed to be where he lived. We also have a body. We know where he's buried. And we don't exhume ex-presidents very often, but I assume he's there.
Quarters named it.
What was that?
Pick up a quarter.
Oh, he's on the quarter?
I was gonna say money with his picture.
Yeah, dollar bill. Well, actually, art. We have imagery of George Washington, and some of which was made during a time period where he was still living. He sat for portraits that were taken of him. There are portraits of all our presidents that exist as an official record of their likeness. So that's perfectly legitimate that there's pictures of him. Jim?
Yeah, I know George Washington existed because I carry him around my pocket every day on a $1 bill.
Yeah. He doesn't. Washington's not as handy as he used to be. You can't really get a lot with a George Washington anymore. Maybe a piece of candy.
And you know, he's the first president, that's why he's on the $1.
Is it? Yeah. So that's our evidence. What's if we're being critical about it? You know, what kind of things do we see? Well, you know, if we ask ourselves, okay, is there corroborating evidence? You know, there's documents that are not made by Washington himself. There are documents that are written by other people that make mention of him. There are letters and correspondence going back and forth between him and other people for which there's historical evidence that they existed too. And they mention him as if he's a real person. If we ask, you know, when did some of these things come about? Well, a lot of the documents that mention him come from the very time period when he was still alive, even the ones that bear his signature.
I would assume you could have, like, England or France would have documents that would reference him, a completely not connected entity referencing him.
Right, so someone who, this is actually one other thing, I'm glad you brought that up because there was something else I wanted to mention. Where did I note that? It's called there's a name for it, and I cannot, here it is, the criterion of embarrassment. I'm not going to bother writing that down. The criterion of embarrassment is a way to evaluate historical narrative, and it essentially says historians, if they're writing about themselves or their own culture, they usually are motivated to paint themselves in a good light. So if you find a historical account that is in a negative light, there is little reason to doubt why that would be faked by the person writing it. It's not a hard proof that it's absolutely true, but it's a tendency. So if England writes in their history about their loss of the colonies and the Continental Army was being led by General George Washington, that would be a mention of an embarrassment on the part of Great Britain that still acknowledges a historical event. Washington used to be a British general, so there's records probably of his service in the British military before he was part of the Revolution. Okay. So I'm willing to accept. You all convinced me that George Washington is real, so I can sleep better at night. All right, we've got about 5 more minutes in class today, so I just hope that kind of gives you some things to think about when it comes to historical evidence. Let's go now to thinking about the Bible itself. We'll spend a little while on thinking about the Gospels, and we're also going to think about the rest of the New Testament. So the question I posed here is that the writers of the 4 canonical Gospels, that's Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they were endeavoring to lay down a record of the things that they had witnessed. How do you see the Gospel writers trying to establish the historicity, basically the historical accuracy of their events? So what I'm asking for here is actually from the Gospels themselves, are there passages that you can think of where the writers of the Gospels try to lay out these events are an eyewitness account?
Well, the one thing I think of is at the very beginning of Luke's gospel, it talks about how he gathered information.
Okay, let's turn there to Luke chapter 1. So Luke, I think, gives the lengthiest intro of his gospel as more of a letter or as a historical document. He says, "Inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the things that have been accomplished among us, just as those who were from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word have delivered them to us. It seemed good to me also, having followed all things closely for some time past, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, that you may have certainty concerning the things you have been taught." And then he begins with, in the days of Herod, king of Judea, there was a priest named Zechariah of the division of Abijah. So the intro to Luke, what are some things that you pull out from that intro? What stood out to you?
Eyewitnesses.
Okay, he mentions eyewitnesses, a plurality of eyewitnesses. So Luke here is acknowledging that the things that you have heard from the beginning were told by multiple people. The people that Luke is writing to have heard the gospel, they've heard about Jesus, but Luke is saying, I'm going to write an account that compiles what you've heard from multiple different people and record it all in one work here. Okay? Anything else stand out to you?
Luke investigated, so he really researched. It wasn't like he just
Okay.
didn't do it.
He's investigating the tone of what's being written here, because some people will try to say that the Bible was created by Christians after the fact, and they wanted to make the Bible sound really good, like they wanted to make it a good story. It's a myth, is essentially the criticism that they'll give. Does this read like mythology? Go ahead, Brace.
Based on the time period that it's written in, it would be really dangerous to offer such specifics with regard to locations and people who were reigning.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you're inaccurate, it would be very easy for someone to call attention to that. And so the amount of specificity with which he describes Herod as king of Judea and a specific priest who was active among the Jewish people at that present time.
Mm.
There's a lot of other facts that Luke records that are the same kind of thing. It's a pretty bold task to try to do that if you don't really know what you're talking about.
Right.
And even people that do know what they're talking about sometimes get the facts wrong.
Mm-hmm. Yes, so things can be recorded in error. Things can be recorded that are misremembered or not accurate to the events. We believe that the Gospels are, as they're being written, are also being directed by the Holy Spirit so that they conform to the inerrancy of Scripture. But this reads not like mythology. This doesn't read like poetry. You might say, well, the beginning of John, it's kind of like a little bit poetic in some of the word pictures. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Some of that is imagery. But here Luke is saying, here's what happened. I'm just telling you what happened. This is how it happened, and this all happened. He also mentions the recent nature of what happened. Having followed all things closely for some time past, to write an orderly account to you. So he's acknowledging that this is what happened in the past, in our own past, but he's still close to the events. And Brace brings up a good point too about, he immediately launches into it by setting the stage of the days of Herod, king of Judea, including details like that can and have been verified through secular history, Roman history. There's no reason, if you were making up the Gospels, to necessarily do that, other than to say that it lends it more historical credence. I think it's at the crucifixion of Jesus. There's two mentions of high priests. I think is it Annas and Caiaphas? And we've talked before about how different audiences would have seen one as the real Jewish high priest, and the other one was a high priest that was established by the Roman ruling party. So, is that a contradiction? Again, we say, look at where the accounts differ. And is there an explanation for the differing of those accounts? And that's an example in the Gospels where you have a difference in the account, but it's understood there's a historical reason why that difference exists. So that further goes to show why this isn't an inaccuracy, this isn't a mistake on the part of the writers. All right, well, the bell did ring. So be thinking about this. I want to talk some more about the Gospels. And also, one thing I noted that maybe we'll go through on Sunday is a look at the timeline to see how recent the Gospels were written to the events that they describe. There's some interesting history there. And then we'll also start thinking about Paul and his writings as well. Paul does a lot of things to try to establish the factual and historical nature of what he writes. And then we'll get into some non-biblical sources. So thank you all for your participation this evening. Thanks very much.